Krokodil was cheaper than vodka and ate your flesh down to the bone. Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a drug that cost less than a bottle of Coca-Cola, got you higher than heroin, and ate your body alive while you slept. Not metaphorically, literally. The flesh, the muscle, sometimes the bone underneath, and the most insane part. People knew exactly what it did, and cooked another batch anyway. Krokodil arrived in Russia at a very specific moment in history, the way all catastrophes do, quietly, through the back door, dressed up as a solution to a different problem. It didn't come from a cartel. It didn't arrive on a boat. It was born in Russian kitchens by Russian hands out of Russian desperation. And it spread the way fire spreads in a building where every wall is already dry. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. To understand Krokodil, you have to understand Russia in 2008. Not the Russia of Moscow skyscrapers and oligarch yachts, the other Russia. The one east of the Urals, where cities built around single Soviet factories had been slowly dying since 1991. In Yekaterinburg, Novosibirsk, Omsk, Chelyabinsk, cities most Westerners couldn't find on a map, unemployment in certain districts ran at 30–40%. The Soviet system had promised these places a purpose. When the USSR collapsed, it took the purpose with it and left the building standing. What filled the vacuum was predictable and ugly: alcohol, crime, and eventually heroin. Through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, heroin from Afghanistan flooded Russia. The pipeline ran through Central Asia, through Kazakhstan, through Tajikistan, through the porous borders of a country still figuring out what it was. By 2005, Russia had an estimated 2 million heroin users, one of the highest per capita rates in the world. Heroin was cheap, it was available, and it was destroying entire generations in industrial cities that the Kremlin had largely stopped thinking about. Then, something shifted. After 2001, NATO operations in Afghanistan disrupted cultivation in key growing regions. Supply chains fractured. Afghan heroin became harder to move and more expensive to buy. By 2008 and 2009, the street price of heroin in Russian cities had roughly doubled. For a middle-class user in Moscow, this was an inconvenience. For an unemployed worker in Siberia earning next to nothing, it was a wall. Addiction doesn't respond to economics the way rational behavior does. A heroin addict whose supply just became twice as expensive doesn't quit. The brain won't allow it. What the brain does instead is problem solve with whatever is available. And in Russia, what was available in 2008 and 2009 was something that, on paper, looked like a viable substitute. Codeine, a mild opioid, found in over-the-counter painkiller tablets sold legally at pharmacies across Russia. One box cost the equivalent of a few dollars, and someone, it's impossible to pin down exactly who, exactly when, because this knowledge spread like folklore, discovered that if you processed codeine pills through a specific series of chemical reactions using household and hardware store ingredients, you could produce a homemade opioid far stronger than the original pill. The result was desomorphine, a synthetic opioid first synthesized in 1932, estimated to be 8 to 10 times more potent than morphine. It had a street name almost immediately: Krokodil. The name came from the skin. Within weeks of regular injection, the tissue around injection sites turned green, then grey, then black. The skin thickened and cracked into hard, scaly patches, reptilian, horrifying, unmistakable. Anyone who saw it knew instantly what they were looking at. The name wasn't poetic. it was diagnostic. The spread was faster than any official body was prepared to track. In 2008, Russian addiction specialists started seeing unusual wounds in patients, necrotic tissue, bone exposure, injuries that didn't match any known drug profile. By 2009, case reports were appearing in regional medical journals. By 2010, hospitals in Siberian cities were dedicating entire wards to patients whose bodies were coming apart in ways that doctors had no established protocol for treating. The drug moved through social networks at speed, because in many communities the social network was the production network. One person learned the process, taught 3 others, and each of those taught 3 more. Here is the fact that sets the entire scale of this story. By 2011, Russia had the highest rate of drug injection-related deaths in the world, not per capita. In raw numbers, a country with 143 million people was losing more people to injected drugs than any other nation on Earth. International health organizations were issuing reports. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime flagged Russia as a catastrophic outlier. And in the small apartments of Siberian cities, people were still scraping phosphorus off matchboxes and cooking over gas flames because the alternative, withdrawal, was simply not survivable without help that didn't exist. Morphine as a chemical compound had a specific and terrible logic to it. The high came fast. Within minutes of injection, users described an intense warmth, a dissolution of every anxiety and physical sensation, a bliss that heroin users said was stronger than anything they had experienced. This was partly the drug's potency, and partly the impurities in the homemade product, which created unpredictable spikes of effect. The problem, beyond the tissue destruction, beyond the chemical contamination, was the duration. Morphine metabolizes far faster than heroin. The high lasted between 90 minutes and 2 hours. After that, withdrawal began. 2 hours, then back to the stove. This was not a drug you used twice a day. This was not even a drug you used 5 times a day. This was a drug that chained people to a production cycle around the clock, with no breaks, no sleep, no pause for anything except the chemistry. The full implications of that 2-hour window are the subject of what comes next, but understanding it begins here, with the basic pharmacology of a compound that the human body burned through like cheap fuel. Russia in 2010 was a country with 2 simultaneous realities operating in the same geography. In one reality, the economy was recovering from the 2008 financial crisis, oil revenues were stabilizing the ruble, and Moscow was hosting international events and attracting foreign investment. In the other reality, in the same country, in cities 4 hours east by plane, people were dissolving. Both realities were true at exactly the same time, and the government in the first reality was in no particular hurry to fully confront the scale of what was happening in the second. The geography of the epidemic was not random. It tracked almost perfectly onto post-Soviet industrial decline, the cities that lost their factories, their subsidies, their reason to exist. Krokodil spread along the same corridors of unemployment and abandonment that alcohol had travelled before it. What changed was the intensity. Alcohol was slow. Alcohol took years to destroy a person. Krokodil was efficient. The documented average life expectancy after first injection ranged between 1 and 3 years, depending on frequency of use and access to any kind of medical care. 1 to 3 years, not decades of gradual decline, not a slow fade, a hard, accelerating collapse, visible to everyone around the addict, impossible to hide, and by the time most families understood what they were seeing, it was already far too late to reverse. The story of Krokodil is not a story about a drug. It is a story about what a society looks like when it decides, not dramatically, not in a single moment, but through 1,000 small decisions and abandonments, that certain people don't count. The drug was just chemistry. The catastrophe was human. And to understand how deep it went, you have to step inside the kitchens where it was made. The apartment looked ordinary from the outside. Peeling paint on the door, a worn mat, the faint smell of cooked food drifting into the hallway. But step inside and the smell changed. Something chemical, sharp, somewhere between a nail salon and an auto garage. The windows were covered. The kitchen table was cleared of everything except a collection of items that, individually, you could buy at any pharmacy or hardware store in Russia without a single question asked. This was the Krokodil kitchen, and in 2010 there were thousands of them. The recipe spread through word of mouth, through prison networks, through the informal social webs of people who already knew each other from the heroin world. It was not written down in any one place. It was passed person to person the way folk remedies are passed, adapted, modified, never quite standardized. But the core ingredients remained consistent, and their accessibility was the entire point. Codeine-based painkiller tablets were the foundation, specifically tablets sold under brand names like Kodlak and Solpadeine, available without prescription at Russian pharmacies for the equivalent of $2 to $3 per box. A single cooking session required multiple boxes, but even so, the total cost of ingredients for a dose of Krokodil came out to roughly a quarter of the street price of equivalent heroin. For someone in Omsk earning nothing, that gap wasn't merely significant, it was the entire decision. Beyond the codeine pills, the process required paint thinner or lighter fluid as a solvent, hydrochloric acid or battery acid as a reagent, red phosphorus scraped manually from the strike pads of matchboxes, iodine from a pharmacy, and in some recipes, industrial cleaning products. None of these items appeared on any restricted list before 2012. A person could walk into 3 different stores on the same street and come home with everything needed. The process itself took between 4 and 6 hours, depending on the recipe variant and the experience of the cook. It was not simple. It required specific temperatures, precise timing, and a working knowledge of basic chemical reactions that most users didn't formally have but had learned through repetition and disaster. Failed batches were common, especially among beginners. Some failed batches exploded. Others simply produced a substance so impure it caused immediate chemical burns on injection, which users sometimes injected anyway, because withdrawal had already started and the clock was running. Cooking Krokodil filled the apartment with fumes. The solvent vapours alone were enough to cause headaches, dizziness, and long-term neurological damage from repeated exposure. The people cooking were breathing in these fumes for hours, sometimes in apartments with no functional ventilation. The neighbours knew. The smell passed under doors and through ventilation shafts and embedded itself in hallway walls. In several documented residential buildings in Yekaterinburg, residents described knowing exactly which apartment was cooking simply by standing in the corridor and breathing. The final product never looked the same twice. It ranged from pale yellow to deep brown, sometimes with a reddish tint from phosphorus compounds that hadn't fully precipitated out of solution. It was drawn up into syringes that were often shared, often reused until they were barely functional, often contaminated with bacteria from injection sites that had already begun to break down. The liquid wasn't pharmaceutical. It wasn't even close. It was a chemical approximation, a rough sketch of morphine surrounded by a constellation of toxic byproducts that the body had no mechanism to clear. What entered the bloodstream alongside the morphine was a specific collection of poisons. Iodine compounds accumulated in the thyroid and surrounding tissue. Phosphorus compounds attacked blood vessels directly, collapsing them from the inside, which is why the skin at injection sites died so quickly. The blood supply to the area was simply destroyed. Lead and other heavy metals leached from battery acid and solvent containers deposited in bone marrow and organ tissue. Each injection was not one insult to the body. It was 6 or 7 simultaneous ones. Experienced cooks developed what they believed were purification techniques, additional filtration steps, different solvent ratios, longer precipitation times. In reality, these refinements removed some contaminants while concentrating others. A clean batch of Krokodil was still catastrophically toxic by any clinical standard. The only variable that purification genuinely changed was the speed at which the body visibly broke down, not whether it broke down, only when. The kitchen had a social function beyond production. In cities where Krokodil had taken hold, the cooking apartment became a gathering point. Users came to cook together, share ingredients when one person had codeine and another had solvent, pool resources during the stretches when money was completely gone. There was a brutal cooperative logic to it. Sharing the space and the ingredients meant more people got a dose and the cost was distributed. What it also meant was that multiple people were being poisoned in the same room simultaneously, and that if anything went wrong chemically or medically, everyone present was equally without resources. Fires were not rare. The solvents used in production were highly flammable. The cooking process required open flame in many recipe variants, and the people performing these operations were addicted, sleep-deprived, and chemically impaired. In Yekaterinburg in 2011, fire department records documented a cluster of apartment fires in one residential district that investigators initially struggled to explain. The fires were starting in kitchens, burning fast and hot, and the accelerant pattern was unusual. When the connection to Krokodil production became clear, it reframed not just those fires but several others in the previous year that had been recorded as accidental cooking incidents. In one documented building in that same district, 3 apartments on the same floor were confirmed Krokodil production sites simultaneously. The residents of those 3 apartments did not constitute 3 separate social circles. They were the same group, rotating between spaces when one became too dangerous, too damaged, or too visible. They shared ingredients, shared equipment, and shared the progressive physical collapse that came with the drug. 2 of the 3 apartments suffered fires within the same week in early 2011. The third continued operating. The people cooking Krokodil were not chemists. They were not reckless teenagers experimenting. Many were adults in their 20s and 30s who had previously used heroin, who understood addiction, and who had made a cold-eyed calculation that this was the available option. The transition from heroin to Krokodil often happened within days of heroin becoming unaffordable, not weeks, not months. The withdrawal pressure made delay impossible, and Krokodil was right there, manufacturable in the same apartment where the decision was made. What this meant medically was that the point of first Krokodil injection often came when the person's body was already in heroin withdrawal, stressed, depleted, maximally vulnerable. The first hit landed in a system that had been deprived of opioids for hours or days, which intensified both the euphoric effect and the physiological shock of what was now being introduced into the bloodstream. Doctors who treated early Krokodil cases noted that the initial tissue damage often appeared faster in people who had come directly off heroin, as though the withdrawal state had somehow accelerated the body's response to the new toxins. The kitchen laboratory was the true centre of the Krokodil epidemic, not the injection, not the high, not even the physical destruction, but the hours spent in that room, breathing fumes, handling acid, scraping phosphorus, watching a toxic liquid drip through improvised filters into a waiting syringe. Everything else followed from what happened in that kitchen. The wounds, the deaths, the collapsed families. All of it had its origin in the specific, terrible moment when someone decided that what they could make at home was close enough to what they needed. Close enough. Those two words contain the entire catastrophe. Every addiction has its own internal rhythm. Heroin users could, in theory, function between doses, sleep, eat, hold a conversation, pretend at normalcy for a few hours before the need returned. Alcohol created its own jagged schedule but allowed gaps. Even the most aggressive stimulant addictions had windows of relative calm. Krokodil had none of these. It operated on a clock, and the clock never stopped, and it gave nobody anywhere to hide. 90 minutes, sometimes 2 hours if the batch was strong. That was the window between injection and the beginning of withdrawal. Not the end of the high, the beginning of the next crisis. The math was merciless. If withdrawal started 2 hours after injection, and cooking a new batch took 4 to 6 hours, then the addict was always behind. Always already in pain before the next dose was ready. The clock was always running, and no one was ever ahead of it. This single pharmacological fact restructured every aspect of life around the drug. Sleep became nearly impossible, because sleeping meant missing a cooking cycle, and missing a cooking cycle meant waking up in withdrawal so severe that several documented cases ended in seizures. Eating stopped within days of developing a full habit, partly because the drug suppressed appetite and partly because the time that would have been spent eating was occupied by cooking. Personal hygiene disappeared. The outside world disappeared. Everything that had existed in a person's life before Krokodil, work, family, friends, ambition, memory, compressed down to a single repeating task. Cook, inject, wait, cook again. The addicts themselves described the experience in terms that were less about pleasure and more about prevention. The high was real, but after the first few days of use, the primary motivation wasn't chasing euphoria. It was preventing the agony of withdrawal. Morphine withdrawal was documented by Russian physicians as among the most physically severe opioid withdrawal syndromes they had ever encountered, compounded by the toxic burden already accumulating in the user's tissues. One narcologist in Novosibirsk described his patients' withdrawal presentations as combining the worst features of heroin withdrawal, heavy metal poisoning, and chemical burn response simultaneously. The body under continuous Krokodil use existed in a specific and terrible state. It was never fully high and never fully well. The brief window of disomorphine effect gave way to a crash that was not simply the absence of pleasure, but the active presence of pain, bone pain, joint pain, the particular burning sensation that came from iodine and phosphorus compounds working through tissue. Then the cooking began again, and the fumes added another layer of neurological stress, and the injection added another dose of chemical trauma to a circulatory system already compromised by previous injections. The cycle was self-compounding. Each round left the body slightly more damaged than the last, which meant each withdrawal was slightly worse, which meant the motivation to inject again was slightly more desperate. Within a week of continuous use, users stopped being able to track time in any conventional sense. The rhythm of the drug replaced the rhythm of the day. There was no morning and no night. There was pre-injection and post-injection. There was the fire under the pot and the liquid in the syringe. Several survivors described this period with remarkable consistency. The sensation that time had collapsed into a single, endlessly repeating present tense, with no past worth remembering and no future they could conceptualize. The social structure that formed around the 2-hour clock was unlike anything addiction researchers in Russia had previously documented. Because no single person could maintain continuous production alone, the physical demands of cooking while simultaneously managing withdrawal made solo operation nearly impossible. Krokodil created cooperative units. Groups of 3 to 6 people, often living together in a single apartment, organised themselves into informal production shifts. While one person cooked, others waited, injected, crashed. When the batch was ready, the cook stopped and someone else took over. The rotation kept production continuous and ensured that no single person had to be functional enough to cook while in full withdrawal. These arrangements had the superficial appearance of community, people pooling resources, looking after each other, maintaining a shared operation. What they actually were was a group of people collectively accelerating each other's destruction, because the cooperative structure removed the natural friction that might have forced one person to stop. A solo addict eventually hit a wall, ran out of money, couldn't physically cook, had a moment of clarity in which stopping seemed possible. Within a group production unit, that wall never appeared. When one person faltered, the others covered the gap. The system was self-perpetuating. Money disappeared within days. The cost of ingredients, even at Krokodil's lower price point relative to heroin, added up across 12 daily doses. Phones went first, then jewellery, then furniture, then anything in the apartment with resale value. Families reported returning to relatives' homes to find entire rooms stripped, not violently, not dramatically, just quietly emptied, one object at a time, each sold for enough to cover the next round of codeine pills and lighter fluid. The addict in question was usually present during this process, watching their former life convert itself into chemistry. Theft expanded the resource pool temporarily. Most Krokodil users in this phase moved through a predictable sequence of criminal activity. Petty theft from family first, then from neighbours and strangers, then more serious crimes as the need intensified. Russian police in Siberian cities documented a specific spike in pharmacy break-ins during 2010 and 2011, targeting specifically the shelves where codeine-based products were stocked. The pattern was geographically consistent. Cities with high Krokodil prevalence showed the same profile of pharmaceutical theft regardless of their location. The apartment itself transformed in parallel with its occupants. Surfaces that had once been used for normal domestic life became chemical workspaces. The walls nearest the stove absorbed solvent fumes and turned yellow. Ventilation grills clogged with residue. The linoleum around the cooking area developed chemical burns. The bathroom, if it was used at all, accumulated bandaging materials, bloody cotton, and improvised wound care supplies. Neighbours in shared residential buildings sometimes described the hallway outside a Krokodil apartment as feeling different, heavier, chemical, wrong, without being able to articulate exactly what the wrongness was. The 2-hour clock also created a specific relationship with pain that had no precedent in ordinary addiction. Morphine was a powerful analgesic. While the drug was active, users felt almost nothing physically. The wounds forming at injection sites, the tissue damage spreading outward, the bone degradation beginning in the jaw and extremities, none of it registered while the drug was working. Then the drug stopped working, and everything registered at once. 2 hours of accumulating physical damage arrived in the user's awareness simultaneously as the crash hit. The brain interpreted this as withdrawal rather than injury, which drove injection rather than medical attention. This feedback loop, pain interpreted as need rather than damage, was possibly the single most medically catastrophic feature of Krokodil addiction. It meant that users were receiving no accurate information from their bodies about what was happening to them. The body was sending emergency signals, and the brain was routing those signals directly into the compulsion to cook and inject, bypassing any response that might have led to treatment. Doctors who later treated survivors described patients with wounds so advanced that, by any rational assessment, they should have been seeking emergency care for weeks, yet had continued using, continued cooking, continued functioning in the rhythm of the 2-hour clock until the body finally failed to the point where function became impossible. And when that point arrived, when the wounds were too deep, the infections too systemic, the physical collapse too complete to sustain even the minimum activity required to cook, what happened next was not rescue. It was not a hospital and a recovery and a second chance. Most of the time, it was something far simpler and far darker, which is where the medical reality of what Krokodil actually does to a human body becomes impossible to discuss in the abstract any longer. There is a specific medical term for what Krokodil did to human tissue: necrotizing fasciitis, the destruction of the soft tissue layers beneath the skin. It is one of the most feared diagnoses in emergency medicine under normal circumstances, typically caused by bacterial infection, treated aggressively with surgery, and still carrying a mortality rate of 30% even with the best available care. Krokodil caused a version of this process chemically, systematically and continuously in people who had no access to best available care and were actively re-injecting the causative agent every 2 hours. The destruction followed a sequence that Russian physicians documented with grim consistency across hundreds of patients throughout 2010 and 2011. It always started at the injection site. The vein would collapse first. Krokodil's chemical load destroyed venous walls rapidly, forcing users to find new injection points within weeks. Each new site underwent the same progression: initial bruising, then a hardening of the surrounding tissue, then discoloration spreading outward in a rough circle, grey at the centre deepening to a dark green at the edges. The skin that had given the drug its name was not a metaphor. It was a direct visual record of tissue death. Below the surface, the process was more complex and more total. The phosphorus compounds in the mixture attacked blood vessels at a microscopic level, collapsing the capillary networks that supplied oxygen and nutrients to tissue. Without blood supply, tissue died, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily and without reversal. Dead tissue became a breeding environment for opportunistic bacterial infections, which spread into surrounding living tissue, which then also lost its blood supply, which also died. The infection and the chemical damage were mutually reinforcing, each one accelerating the other in a cascade that moved faster than most treating physicians had seen in any other context. Bone exposure was not rare. It was documented in the majority of severe cases. When soft tissue died and sloughed away, what remained underneath was bone. Not infected bone in most early cases, but clean, white, anatomically intact bone simply sitting exposed to the environment through what had recently been functional skin. Physicians described the clinical presentation in terms that sounded like they belonged in a forensic report rather than a hospital chart. Patients arrived with visible ulnar bones in their forearms, with femur heads exposed at the hip, with jaw tissue so comprehensively destroyed that teeth sat in gum tissue that had separated from the underlying mandible. The jaw was a specific and recurring site of catastrophic damage. Krokodil's phosphorus load had a documented affinity for bone tissue. Phosphorus necrosis of the jaw was a phenomenon previously known mainly from historical cases of workers in 19th century match factories who developed a condition called phossy jaw from chronic phosphorus exposure. Krokodil addicts were developing the same condition within months of first use, not years. The jawbone would begin to die from the inside, losing density, developing internal cavities, eventually becoming so fragile that normal eating caused fractures. Several patients lost portions of their jaw not through surgery, but through the simple mechanical stress of chewing. The extremities concentrated the worst visible damage. Hands and feet, being the most common injection sites after central veins collapsed, showed the most advanced necrosis in many patients. Fingers blackened and mummified, not through frostbite but through total vascular collapse, while the patient was still alive and still using. Toes separated from feet along lines of tissue death that corresponded precisely to the distribution of failed blood vessels. Surgeons performing amputations on Krokodil patients described the tissue planes as fundamentally altered. The normal anatomical boundaries between structures had dissolved into a uniform zone of death that made clean surgical margins difficult to establish. One documented case from Krasnoyarsk became a reference point in Russian addiction medicine literature. A young woman in her mid-20s began using Krokodil in early 2010. By August of that year, less than 8 months after her first injection, she had developed bilateral lower limb necrosis severe enough to require amputation of both legs below the knee. She was 26 years old. She was conscious throughout. She was in withdrawal during the preoperative assessment because there was no opioid substitution therapy available to manage her addiction medically, and the hospital had no protocol for treating Krokodil patients that addressed anything beyond the immediate surgical emergency. After the amputations, she was discharged into the same social environment from which she had come, with the same absence of support structures, and with a body now significantly more compromised than when she had first picked up the drug. The speed of this destruction confounded physicians who were accustomed to managing addiction-related medical complications on timescales of years or decades. Alcoholic liver disease took a decade to become critical. Heroin-related endocarditis was serious but treatable. Krokodil compressed a lifetime of physical damage into months. Doctors at regional hospitals in Omsk and Novosibirsk described the experience of treating these patients as professionally disorienting. The wounds didn't behave according to any established healing timeline. The infections didn't respond to standard antibiotic protocols because the underlying tissue damage kept expanding. And the patients, when they were medically stable enough to receive them, were the hardest to retain in care because the drug's 2-hour cycle made extended hospitalization functionally incompatible with ongoing addiction. The internal damage was less visible but equally comprehensive. Heavy metals accumulated in organ tissue over months of use, causing progressive kidney failure, liver dysfunction, and neurological deterioration. The brain itself was affected, not through the morphine alone, which as an opioid produced standard opioid effects, but through the solvent components and heavy metal burden that crossed the blood-brain barrier with each injection. Long-term Krokodil users showed cognitive changes consistent with heavy metal encephalopathy, slowed processing, memory fragmentation, emotional blunting, and in severe cases the kind of profound personality alteration that made them unrecognizable to people who had known them before. What made the body's response to Krokodil uniquely horrifying was the dissociation between visible damage and experienced pain. Morphine suppressed pain so effectively that addicts with open wounds down to bone frequently reported no significant discomfort while the drug was active. The body was screaming at the cellular level, inflammatory cascades running at maximum intensity, immune responses consuming resources faster than they could be replenished. But the brain received none of this information accurately. The drug had effectively disconnected the warning system from the console. By the time the drug wore off and the pain arrived, it arrived as a wall, total and overwhelming, interpreted not as an alarm about wounds that needed treatment, but as the specific agony of withdrawal that had one known solution. Physicians began documenting cases where this dissociation had reached a point that defied clinical logic. Patients who walked into emergency rooms walked unassisted, with injuries that by any anatomical assessment should have rendered walking impossible. A man in Yekaterinburg presented to an ER in 2011 with both feet showing advanced necrosis, visible tendon exposure on the dorsum of the right foot, and a systemic infection that had been progressing for weeks. He had walked 3 blocks from his apartment to the hospital. He was not in acute pain at the time of presentation because he had injected approximately 90 minutes before arrival. By the time triage had processed him and a physician saw him, withdrawal had started, and what the physician encountered was a patient whose dominant concern was not the state of his feet, but the onset of opioid withdrawal, because his nervous system, shaped by months of Krokodil, had learned to rank those two threats in that order. The wounds that didn't receive surgical intervention didn't stabilize. They spread. Necrosis without debridement expanded outward along tissue planes, following blood vessel distributions, moving from limb to trunk in cases that went untreated long enough. Secondary sepsis, full systemic infection from bacteria colonizing dead tissue, was the most common proximate cause of death in Krokodil cases that didn't involve direct overdose. The body, having failed to signal its own destruction accurately while the drug was active, eventually reached a threshold of systemic failure that no amount of morphine could suppress. Fever spiked, organ function crashed. And even then, documented cases showed addicts attempting to continue the cycle, attempting to cook, attempting to inject, as their bodies entered septic shock. The medical staff who treated these patients carried their own burden that went beyond clinical challenge. Nurses in Siberian regional hospitals described the experience of changing dressings on Krokodil patients as something that required deliberate psychological preparation, not because of squeamishness, which training addressed, but because the wounds looked wrong in a way that bypassed professional detachment. They looked like something that shouldn't exist in a living person, and the patients, many of them young, many of them still intermittently lucid between doses, were often acutely aware of what their bodies had become. The lucid intervals were not moments of peace. They were confrontations with a physical reality so extreme that the drug that had caused it also functioned as the only available means of escape from the knowledge of it. That particular trap, using the poison to escape awareness of what the poison was doing, was the most complete form of captivity the drug created. And it existed inside a political and medical system that was, for reasons both ideological and bureaucratic, almost entirely unprepared to break it. In 2011, a drug addiction specialist working at a Moscow treatment facility gave an interview to a foreign journalist. He described his ward's outcomes for Krokodil patients with the flat precision of someone who had stopped being surprised by the numbers. Not a single patient admitted with advanced Krokodil addiction had survived to discharge. Not one. The ward's Krokodil mortality rate was, functionally, 100%. He said this without drama, without visible emotion, and then moved on to discuss bed allocation problems. That specific combination, the statistic and the bureaucratic pivot, captured something essential about how Russia's medical and political establishment had positioned itself relative to the epidemic consuming its peripheral cities. The position was not ignorance. By 2010 and 2011, Russian health authorities had access to the same case reports, the same regional hospital data, the same mortality figures that were alarming international health organizations. The Federal Drug Control Service, known by its Russian acronym FSKN, was an agency with significant resources and a direct reporting line to the Kremlin. Regional addiction specialists have been filing reports on the new wound pattern since 2008. The information existed. What didn't exist was the political framework to act on it in any way that might have actually helped the people dying. Russia's approach to drug addiction under Putin had calcified into a single ideological position. Addiction was a moral failure and a criminal matter, not a medical one. This wasn't a fringe view within the government. It was the official, codified stance, embedded in legislation, and reflected in how treatment was funded, structured, and evaluated. The criminal code treated drug use and possession as offences warranting imprisonment, with minimal distinction between personal use and distribution. There were no diversion programs that might redirect addicts from prison into treatment. There was no legal framework for harm reduction. Harm reduction, the international public health approach, built around minimizing the dangers of drug use for people who cannot or will not stop, was effectively banned in Russia on ideological grounds. Needle exchange programs, which had been shown in study after study across dozens of countries to reduce HIV transmission and create contact points between addicts and health services, were illegal. The government's position was that providing clean needles endorsed drug use, regardless of what the mortality data said. Russia had one of the fastest growing HIV epidemics in the world during this period, driven overwhelmingly by injection drug use, and the government's response to harm reduction proposals was to reclassify the concept itself as a form of drug promotion. Methadone maintenance therapy, the gold standard of opioid addiction treatment, used successfully in over 80 countries, backed by decades of clinical evidence, was explicitly prohibited in Russia. The Russian government had banned methadone in 1998 and showed no indication of revisiting this decision, despite consistent pressure from the World Health Organization and UNAIDS. The official reasoning was that treating opioid addiction with another opioid simply replaced one dependency with another. The practical consequence was that there was no medically supported pathway off heroin or Krokodil that didn't involve the full agony of unmanaged withdrawal, which most addicts couldn't survive without intensive medical support that was itself unavailable in most of the country. What treatment did exist came in forms that the international medical community regarded with significant skepticism. State-funded rehabilitation centres were chronically underfunded, understaffed, and concentrated in larger cities, meaning that for an addict in a small Siberian industrial town, the nearest functioning treatment facility might be several hundred kilometres and several thousand rubles away. Private treatment centres were available to those with money, which excluded virtually the entire Krokodil-using population by definition. The infrastructure gap was not a secret. Regional health administrators acknowledged it openly in internal reports while simultaneously requesting budget allocations that the federal government consistently reduced. Into this vacuum stepped the Russian Orthodox Church. The Church had been expanding its social role throughout the Putin years, and addiction rehabilitation was an area where it moved with particular visibility. Church-run rehabilitation centres operated across Russia, offering residential programs built around religious observance, manual labour, and psychological counselling delivered through a theological framework. These programs were not without genuine successes. Some addicts found in the structured communal environment of a church rehabilitation centre something that had been entirely absent from their lives, and the church's reach into rural and post-industrial communities exceeded that of any secular health institution. But the programs also operated without medical oversight, frequently without licensed psychiatric care, and with an approach to addiction that attributed its causes and solutions to spiritual rather than neurological factors. For Krokodil patients with advanced physical damage requiring surgical intervention and medically managed withdrawal, prayer was not a treatment protocol. The 2012 codeine restriction was the Russian government's one significant policy response to the Krokodil epidemic, and its timing told its own story. By June 2012, when over-the-counter codeine sales were made prescription only, the epidemic had been visibly catastrophic for at least 3 years. Hundreds of thousands of people had used the drug. A substantial proportion of them were already dead. The restriction did work. Krokodil production dropped significantly in the following year as the primary ingredient became harder to access. But it worked by removing the supply rather than by addressing the population of people already addicted, and it offered nothing to those whose bodies were already destroyed. The international context made Russia's inaction harder to excuse and easier to understand simultaneously. Portugal had decriminalised personal drug use in 2001 and redirected the resulting resources into treatment and harm reduction. By 2011, Portuguese drug-related HIV infections had fallen by 95%. Drug-related deaths were a fraction of their pre-decriminalisation level, and the policy was being studied by governments worldwide as a model worth replicating. Russian officials were aware of the Portuguese results. The data had been presented to Russian policymakers through multiple channels. The official response was consistent. The Portuguese model reflected Western values incompatible with Russian society, and the Russian approach reflected a moral seriousness that harm reduction abandoned. This ideological rigidity had a specific geographic consequence that was not evenly distributed. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, addicts with resources could access private clinics, could leave the country for treatment in Europe if they had the means, could navigate the system with the advantages that money provides everywhere. In Omsk, in Chelyabinsk, in the smaller post-industrial towns of Siberia and the Urals, no such alternatives existed. The people dying of Krokodil were overwhelmingly from places where the gap between official policy and available reality was absolute. The state's ideological position on addiction didn't cost the state's urban middle class very much. It cost everyone else everything. The FSKN, the Drug Control Agency, grew significantly in budget and personnel during the Krokodil years. Its primary function remained law enforcement, seizure, prosecution, incarceration. Officers were trained and equipped for interdiction operations, not for the kind of public health engagement that might have created early intervention points. When FSKN agents encountered Krokodil users, the legal framework pushed toward criminal processing rather than medical referral. Addicts who might have been reachable at an early stage of dependency instead faced prosecution, which severed whatever fragile social connections remained and deposited them back into the same environment, now with a criminal record after serving time. The hospitals in Siberian cities were caught between the scale of what was arriving through their doors and the near-total absence of specialized resources to treat it. Emergency departments developed improvised protocols. Surgeons who had trained for road accident trauma found themselves managing wounds that required a different conceptual framework entirely. Nurses developed their own informal knowledge networks, sharing observations about wound management between hospitals because no official guidance existed. The medical community was generating real-time clinical knowledge about a condition that had no literature, no precedent, and no treatment pathway, and doing so without additional resources, without policy support, and in many cases without the basic pharmacological tools, like opioid substitution therapy, that could have made patient management medically feasible. What the state's sustained inaction ultimately produced was a situation in which the epidemic was left to resolve itself through the one mechanism that required no policy intervention at all. Krokodil users died. They died in the apartments where they cooked, in the hospitals that couldn't treat them, in the rehabilitation centres that couldn't reach them. And as they died, the population of active users declined, and the numbers began to improve, and years later those improvements were cited in contexts that carefully avoided specifying the mechanism by which they had been achieved. The mechanism was not treatment, it was not policy, it was not compassion, it was attrition. And in the small cities of Siberia, in the residential buildings where the wallpaper still held chemical residue and the neighbours still remembered the smell, the aftermath of that attrition was not relief. It was a specific and heavy silence, the silence of communities that had watched something happen and had not been given a single tool with which to stop it. The first sign was usually the smell. A parent coming home to an apartment that had acquired a chemical undertone underneath the ordinary smells of cooking and lived-in space. Something industrial, something wrong, something that didn't belong in a kitchen where soup had been made the previous evening. Most parents didn't identify it immediately. They opened windows, assumed a neighbour was doing renovation work, went to bed. By the time the smell was strong enough to be undeniable, weeks had usually passed, and the situation inside the apartment was already far beyond the point where a conversation could address it. The families of Krokodil addicts occupied a specific and excruciating position that had no good options at any point along its timeline. Acting early meant acting on suspicion before visible evidence made the reality undeniable. And in families already fragmented by post-Soviet economic stress, by alcoholism in previous generations, by the general emotional exhaustion of surviving in places that had been declining for 20 years, the threshold for confronting a family member on the basis of a smell and a behavioral change was high. Waiting for visible evidence meant waiting until the physical damage was advanced enough to be impossible to ignore, at which point the medical and addiction realities were both severe. The visible evidence, when it came, arrived fast. A son who had been thin became skeletal within weeks. A daughter's arms, glimpsed accidentally, showed bruising patterns that didn't correspond to any innocent explanation. Wounds appeared that were described as accidents, then infections, then things that would heal. Families who had lived through the heroin epidemic of the late 1990s recognized injection drug use. The behavioral pattern was familiar even when the specific drug was not. Families without that reference point took longer, sometimes far too long, to understand what they were witnessing. In Omsk, the case of a grandmother raising 3 grandchildren became one of the most documented family stories of the Krokodil years, not because it was exceptional, but because it was representative. Her son and daughter-in-law had both been using heroin intermittently since the early 2000s. When heroin prices rose in 2009, they switched to Krokodil within weeks of each other, as part of the same social group that had been using together. The grandmother first noticed the chemical smell in spring 2009. By winter of that year, both parents were visibly ill. By summer 2010, the daughter-in-law was dead from sepsis secondary to wound infection. The son survived her by 4 months. The grandmother was 61 years old and was now solely responsible for 3 children under the age of 10, in a city where the state support system for kinship caregivers was nearly non-existent. She applied for guardianship through a bureaucratic process that took 8 months, during which the children existed in a legal grey zone. Siblings faced a different texture of helplessness. An older brother or sister who watched a younger sibling convert to Krokodil had the emotional proximity to understand what was happening, and the social proximity to be constantly present for its consequences, but rarely had any more practical options than a parent would. The criminal penalties for drug use created a specific deterrent against involving authorities. Calling the police about a sibling's drug use was, in the Russian legal framework of 2010, effectively turning them in for prosecution. Prison did not treat addiction. Prison exposed addicts to a wider criminal network, to worse drugs, to the complete absence of any rehabilitative support. Every family member who understood the legal reality faced the same calculation. Involving the state meant prison, not help, and prison was its own form of destruction. The apartments themselves became contested spaces in ways that were both practical and deeply strange. A family member still living in the same flat as an active Krokodil user was simultaneously a witness, an involuntary participant in the chemical environment, and often the last practical barrier between the addict and complete physical collapse. Mothers in multiple documented cases took on wound care for addicted children, not because they had medical training, but because the wounds existed and no one else was present to address them. They learned to clean necrotic tissue, to apply dressings, to identify the specific smell of infection that meant a hospital visit could no longer be avoided. This was not exceptional devotion. It was the ordinary response of people who had been given no alternative. The economic dimension of family involvement added another layer of coercion. Krokodil users who had exhausted their own resources turned to family members with a pressure that addiction made relentless. The 2-hour clock didn't respect family dynamics or the emotional boundaries that normal relationships operate within. An addict in withdrawal, in genuine physical agony, asking for money from a mother or a sister, created a form of emotional coercion that most family members found impossible to resist consistently. Each concession reinforced the pattern. Each refusal was followed by escalation, first emotional, then sometimes physical. Documented cases included addicts selling family members' possessions without permission, taking money from elderly parents' pension funds, and in several cases theft that was prosecuted criminally without the family's cooperation, discovered only after the fact. The children inside these households were the least visible victims and potentially the most comprehensively damaged. A child growing up in an apartment where Krokodil was being cooked was exposed to chemical fumes during neurologically critical developmental periods. They witnessed physical deterioration of a parent in a compressed time frame that no child psychology framework had been designed to address. They understood, at ages where understanding should have been limited to simpler things, that the adult who was supposed to protect them was instead disappearing in front of them, not metaphorically, not gradually, but in the most literal possible sense, losing pieces of themselves while remaining physically present. School records in districts with high Krokodil prevalence showed consistent patterns. Attendance dropped among children from affected households. Academic performance deteriorated sharply. Teachers in several documented cases noted that they could identify children from Krokodil households not through direct knowledge but through behavioral markers: extreme vigilance, difficulty concentrating, the specific social withdrawal of children managing secrets too large for their age. The school system had no protocol for these children. Social services were underfunded and overwhelmed. The children moved through the normal infrastructure of childhood: classrooms, playgrounds, school meals, carrying weights that the institutions around them were entirely unprepared to acknowledge. Some families shattered cleanly. One member became addicted. The rest removed themselves with varying degrees of decisiveness and guilt. Others fragmented slowly, each member reconfiguring their relationship to the crisis at a different pace. A few families held together through the entire arc of the addiction and its consequences, sustained by a combination of love and the absence of anywhere else to go. None of these outcomes were good. The clean break left the addict fully isolated and accelerated the physical collapse the 2-hour clock was already driving. The slow fragmentation produced the prolonged exposure to trauma that damaged everyone involved incrementally. The family that stayed intact did so at a cost measured in the health, the finances, the emotional reserves, and occasionally the safety of everyone who stayed. The community level told an even bleaker story. In the smaller post-industrial towns where Krokodil hit hardest, the social network and the drug network were often the same network. A community where 30 or 40% of adults were unemployed was a community where people spent significant time together in shared spaces: courtyards, shared kitchen buildings in Soviet-era communal housing, informal gathering places. When Krokodil entered this network, it spread along social ties that had previously served genuinely connective functions. The friend group became the cooking group. The neighbour who had shared meals became the person whose apartment smelled of solvent. The social fabric and the drug production infrastructure became interchangeable, and communities that tried to resist found that the boundaries between them and the epidemic were not external walls, but the faces of people they had known for years. Residents of affected neighbourhoods described years later a quality of collective grief that had no official acknowledgement and therefore no formal space to exist. Nobody organised a memorial for the people who had died. There were no civic rituals for what had happened. The bodies were buried or cremated, the apartments were eventually cleaned or abandoned, and the neighbours who had watched everything continued living in the same buildings, breathing the same air, walking past the same doors, carrying what they had witnessed in the wordless, unprocessed way that people carry things for which their society has provided no language. In the apartment buildings of Omsk and Chelyabinsk and a dozen other cities, there were grandmothers raising grandchildren, siblings sorting through the belongings of the dead, parents who had outlived their children in a sequence of events that had moved so fast it had left no time for any of the normal human responses to loss. And somewhere in those same buildings, in a few remaining apartments, the smell of solvent still occasionally drifted into the corridor, because it wasn't entirely over yet, because not everyone had reached the end of their particular timeline, and the clock was still running for those who remained. In 2011, a small crew from Vice Media flew to Yekaterinburg with a camera and a local fixer and a set of contacts that had been passed through 3 intermediaries before reaching someone willing to open a door. What they filmed inside that door became one of the most widely circulated pieces of drug journalism of the decade, not because of its production quality, which was raw and unpolished, but because the reality it documented was so extreme that viewers across the world responded with the same instinctive disbelief that precedes the slow, awful acceptance that something is real. The Vice documentary was not the first journalistic entry into the Krokodil world. Russian photojournalists had been documenting the epidemic since at least 2009, producing images that circulated in regional newspapers and eventually in European medical journals, where they were reproduced not as journalism but as clinical documentation. The photographs showed wounds that emergency physicians in Western Europe had never encountered outside of warfare or industrial accident contexts. Several European hospitals reproduced the images in internal training materials under the category of chemical trauma, because no existing wound classification system had a column for what Krokodil produced. What separated the Vice footage from the photographic record was duration and context. Still photographs showed the wounds. Video showed the people attached to the wounds, conscious, communicative, embedded in the specific domestic reality of the Krokodil apartment, surrounded by cooking equipment and improvised medical supplies, and the ordinary furniture of lives that had been entirely consumed by the drug. The crew filmed inside multiple apartments over several days. They documented the cooking process, the injection, the brief window of relative calm, and the onset of the next withdrawal cycle. They filmed people whose physical condition, viewed clinically, should have placed them in intensive care, and who were instead sitting in their own kitchens, maintaining the 2-hour rhythm, because intensive care was not a realistic option for them in any practical sense. One sequence from the documentary became a specific reference point in discussions of the epidemic's human scale. A man in his early 30s, whose right arm had lost most of its soft tissue from elbow to wrist, was still functionally using that arm to prepare a cooking batch. The bone of his forearm was partially visible through what remained of the surrounding tissue. He moved with the careful economy of someone managing significant physical limitation, but he moved, completing the steps of a process he had performed hundreds of times in a body that was a month or 2 from no longer being able to perform anything at all. The footage didn't editorialize, it didn't need to. Russian state media's response to this documentation followed a consistent pattern throughout 2010 and 2011. Regional stories occasionally appeared in local newspapers, framed primarily as law enforcement successes, raids on production apartments, arrests, seizures. The national channels, which operated under editorial frameworks aligned with Kremlin priorities, were slower to engage with the epidemic as a public health story and more comfortable with the narrative of criminal activity being addressed by competent authorities. Krokodil is a systemic failure of social infrastructure, as evidence of what post-Soviet abandonment had produced in peripheral cities, was not a story that fit comfortably into the national media's preferred narrative architecture. The gap between what was being documented by independent journalists and what was being reported through official channels created a specific information environment in Russian cities most affected by the epidemic. Residents of Novosibirsk and Omsk were living adjacent to a catastrophe that their national television was not fully acknowledging. Local knowledge, the neighbour who had died, the building where the smell was constant, the hospital ward that was always full, circulated through personal networks while the official picture remained partial. This disconnection between lived experience and public narrative was not unique to Russia, but it had particular consequences in a media environment where independent journalism operated under increasing pressure. The BBC investigation, broadcast in 2011, reached audiences across Europe and triggered a round of international medical and policy attention that Russian officials found difficult to ignore entirely. The investigation combined footage from inside Krokodil apartments with interviews from addiction specialists, hospital physicians and public health researchers, assembling a picture of the epidemic's scale and the state's response, or absence of response, that was more analytically comprehensive than anything the Vice footage alone could convey. The Russian government's initial reaction was to question the BBC's sources and to characterize the coverage as exaggerated and politically motivated. Within months, the same officials were citing the epidemic in contexts that acknowledged its severity, which required a quiet abandonment of the earlier dismissals. The international medical community's engagement with Krokodil documentation produced something that had not existed before, a clinical literature for a condition that had no established name or treatment pathway. Wound care specialists, infectious disease physicians, and addiction medicine researchers began publishing case reports and review articles in European and American journals. The photographs and footage that had originally circulated as journalism became clinical evidence, reproduced in peer-reviewed contexts with annotations and treatment notes. Russian physicians who'd been improvising responses to Krokodil wounds for years suddenly found their improvised knowledge codified and reflected back to them through international publications. A strange loop in which Western medical institutions were, in effect, documenting and organizing information that Russian physicians had generated at enormous human cost. The nurses and emergency department staff at Siberian regional hospitals occupied a position that the international coverage mostly abstracted over. The Vice documentary and the BBC investigation showed the apartments and the addicts. They showed the wounds. What they showed less completely was the experience of the people who encountered these patients at 3 a.m. in underfunded emergency rooms, without specialized equipment, without established protocols, and without the psychological support structures that healthcare workers in high-income countries received as a basic professional provision. A nurse at a regional hospital in Yekaterinburg described the experience of her first Krokodil patient in 2009 as professionally destabilizing in a specific way, not because she was unprepared for serious injury, but because the wound didn't respond to any of the clinical frameworks she'd been trained to apply. Standard wound assessment assumed a healing trajectory. Krokodil wounds had no healing trajectory while the patient was actively using, which most of them were. She cleaned and dressed the wound. The patient was discharged because there were no beds and no treatment protocol that justified admission, and the same patient returned 2 weeks later with the wound significantly advanced and new sites forming. This cycle, presentation, inadequate intervention, discharge, deterioration, return, repeated until the patient either stopped coming because they had died or stopped coming because they had deteriorated beyond the point of self-presentation. The medical staff adapted because adaptation was the only available response. Surgeons developed debridement techniques specifically calibrated for crocodile necrosis patterns, which behaved differently from infection-based tissue death. Infection specialists developed empirical antibiotic protocols for the specific bacterial communities that colonize crocodile wounds, drawing on microbiology cultures from their own patient populations rather than from any external guidance. This improvised clinical innovation happened without funding, without recognition, and often without the basic resources: adequate anesthesia, sterile operating environments, post-operative monitoring, that the procedures technically required. The photojournalists who documented the epidemic most extensively paid their own costs. Several developed post-traumatic stress symptoms that they attributed specifically to the compressed intensity of what Krokodil showed. The combination of familiar domestic environments and extreme physical destruction created a cognitive dissonance that didn't resolve the way conventional conflict photography sometimes did. One Russian photographer described the specific difficulty of images that located extreme suffering inside ordinary apartments, with ordinary furniture, in buildings identical to buildings where normal life was continuing on adjacent floors. The horror was not in an exceptional location. It was in the kitchen, next to the stove, in the apartment directly above someone who was eating dinner and watching television, and living a life that the floor beneath their feet was simultaneously failing to contain. The journalism and documentation of the crocodile epidemic ultimately did what journalism is supposed to do. It made something visible that power had chosen not to see. It created the international pressure that contributed to the 2012 codeine restriction. It generated the clinical literature that gave physicians treating these patients something to work with. It forced the Russian state into a public acknowledgement that shifted, however incrementally, what was politically possible in responding to the crisis. But it arrived, in almost every case, after the worst of the damage had already been done. The camera crews got in. The images got out. The policy response came years late, and addressed only one input to a system that had been running for long enough that its population of active users was already dying faster than any intervention could reach them. What the journalists left behind in those apartments, beyond the footage, was the specific knowledge that they had been there and had chosen to document rather than intervene. A choice that journalism requires, but that every person who made it carried afterward in their own particular way. The story got told. The people in the story mostly didn't survive long enough to see what the telling produced. Quitting Krokodil was not a decision. It was a siege. The body that had been running on desomorphine for weeks or months didn't simply stop wanting it. It collapsed into a state of physical emergency so total that the line between withdrawal and medical crisis became functionally meaningless. Physicians who managed Krokodil withdrawal described it as unlike any opioid cessation they had previously encountered, not because the neurochemical mechanism was fundamentally different from heroin withdrawal, but because the accumulated toxic burden in the patient's tissues transformed what should have been a manageable if brutal process into something that occasionally killed people before the drug itself had a chance to. The first 24 hours after the last injection were deceptive. The desomorphine cleared quickly from the system, faster than heroin, consistent with its short duration of action. What arrived in its absence was not the gradual onset of discomfort that heroin withdrawal typically produced, but an immediate total sensory catastrophe. Every nerve ending in the body reported simultaneously. The bones ached with an intensity that patients described, consistently and independently across multiple documented cases, as feeling like the marrow itself was being scraped out. Muscles contracted involuntarily in spasms that could last minutes, leaving the person exhausted and in greater pain than before the spasm began. The fever came next, temperatures of 39–40 degrees Celsius, sustained for days, burning through whatever reserves the body still had after months of nutritional depletion and chemical stress. Sweating and chills alternated without pattern. The cardiovascular system, already compromised by heavy metal accumulation and chronic infection, struggled with the additional demand of fever response. Several documented deaths during attempted Krokodil withdrawal were attributed to cardiac events in patients whose hearts had been structurally damaged by months of toxic exposure and were simply unable to manage the physiological load of the withdrawal process on top of existing damage. Sleep was impossible for the first week and frequently disrupted for the month that followed. This was not the ordinary insomnia of opioid withdrawal, which was itself severe. It was the specific sleeplessness of a nervous system so dysregulated that it could not maintain the sustained inhibition required for sleep. Patients described lying in beds, rigid with pain, aware of every second passing, unable to find any position that reduced the bone pain, waiting for something that didn't come. The psychological dimension of this sleeplessness compounded the physical. Without sleep, the cognitive resources required to maintain the decision to quit eroded faster than they could be replenished, and the knowledge that a single injection would end the suffering immediately was present in every waking moment. The wounds didn't stabilize during withdrawal. This was a medical complication that caught treating physicians off guard in the first wave of cases. The assumption was that stopping the drug would halt the tissue damage and allow some degree of recovery. What actually happened in many cases was that the withdrawal period, with its fever and circulatory stress, temporarily accelerated the progression of existing infections. Dead tissue that had been stable under the drug's suppression of immune response became actively infected as the immune system partially restored function. Wounds that had been chronic and contained became acutely inflamed, produced more discharge, expanded at the margins. The patient was experiencing both the agony of withdrawal and the physical deterioration of wounds worsening simultaneously in a body with no pharmaceutical pain management available. The absence of opioid substitution therapy, methadone, buprenorphine, was the single most consequential gap in Russian withdrawal management. These medications, standard tools in opioid withdrawal treatment across the developed world, would have allowed physicians to manage the neurochemical crisis of desomorphine cessation at a pace the body could tolerate, gradually reducing the opioid stimulus rather than removing it entirely. Without them, medical staff had access to symptomatic treatments, antispasmodics for muscle cramps, antihistamines for sleep, clonidine for cardiovascular stabilization, that addressed individual symptoms without touching the central neurological crisis. The result was a withdrawal experience so brutal that the relapse rate among patients who attempted it without residential support was, by the estimates of Russian addiction specialists, close to total. The few functioning rehabilitation centers that accepted Krokodil patients operated under conditions that required a specific kind of institutional determination to maintain. A center in Novosibirsk that had adapted its facilities to manage Krokodil cases ran a withdrawal protocol that combined symptomatic medication, round-the-clock nursing observation for cardiac complications, wound care by visiting surgical nurses, and what the center's director described as aggressive psychological engagement during any window of lucidity the patient experienced. The protocol had been developed entirely from internal experience, from watching what happened to patients and adjusting based on outcomes. It had no external validation because no validated external protocol existed. Patients who survived the first 2 weeks of withdrawal entered a phase that was less immediately dangerous but psychologically more complex. The acute physical crisis receded. The wounds, in patients whose infections had been controlled, began the first tentative movements towards stabilization. the fog of continuous chemical exposure began to lift, and what the lifting revealed was frequently devastating. A person confronting, with a degree of mental clarity they hadn't possessed in months, the physical state of their own body. Addicts who had been dissociated from their own decay by the drug's continuous pain suppression now experienced the full reality of what had happened to them. Limbs that were missing, wounds that would never fully close, faces that no longer looked like their faces. The psychological literature on this confrontation phase, which was thin because the clinical population was small and short-lived, described a consistent pattern of acute grief response, not for abstract losses but for the physical self. The body that had existed before Krokodil was gone in a way that was not reversible, not improvable, not subject to the normal consolations that addiction recovery narratives offered. Most recovery frameworks included a narrative of restoration. You quit the drug, you get your life back. Krokodil addicts who survived withdrawal and achieved sobriety got their consciousness back inside a body that was permanently and visibly altered, and the gap between those two things was a psychological wound that no existing therapeutic framework had been designed to address. The Russian Orthodox Church's rehabilitation programs were, for many addicts who survived long enough to reach them, the primary option available. The programs varied enormously in quality and approach, ranging from genuine communities of care built around meaningful structure and human connection, to facilities that function more like supervised confinement with religious observance as a compliance mechanism. What the Church could offer that secular alternatives couldn't was presence in communities where nothing else existed. The monasteries and rural retreat centres that ran addiction programs were often located in post-industrial regions where state services had entirely withdrawn, and their physical accessibility made them reachable to people for whom a city-based clinic was a logistical impossibility. Survivors of Krokodil addiction were a small population, and their post-recovery experiences complicated any straightforward narrative of triumph. The physical damage didn't end with sobriety. Amputees needed prosthetics that were expensive and difficult to access through the Russian disability support system. Patients with jaw necrosis required reconstructive surgery that was available in major cities and essentially unavailable elsewhere. Kidney damage from heavy metal accumulation was progressive, meaning that people who had quit the drug years earlier continued to experience declining renal function as a consequence of what they had injected. The drug's timeline extended far beyond the period of use. One documented case became a specific reference point in the limited literature on Krokodil recovery. A man from Samara who had used for approximately 2 years quit in 2011 following a hospitalization for sepsis. He underwent amputation of both feet during that hospitalization. He remained abstinent for 18 months, engaged with a church-based rehabilitation program, rebuilt partial social connections, and was described by his caseworkers as genuinely committed to his recovery. In early 2013, he relapsed. The relapse was attributed in case notes to the combination of chronic pain from his amputations, for which he had access to no adequate pain management, and the complete absence of any sustainable economic pathway for a man with bilateral lower limb amputation and a limited support network in a mid-sized Russian city. He survived the relapse. Not all documented cases did. The subset of Krokodil addicts who managed to quit and then relapsed faced a body that was physiologically more vulnerable than it had been during original use. Less tissue reserve, more compromised circulation, more compromised immune response. A relapse that might have taken months to become critical in a previously healthier user could reach the same endpoint in weeks in someone whose physical resources had already been severely depleted. The second encounter with the drug was frequently shorter and more rapidly fatal than the first. the ones who got clean and stayed clean. And they existed, documented, named specific people with specific survival stories, carried their sobriety inside bodies that bore the complete record of what they had survived. Every visible wound, every amputation, every altered feature was a permanent annotation on a recovery that required every day the same decision to not return to the only thing that had ever reliably stopped the pain. That specific, daily, invisible act of will was the least visible part of the entire Krokodil story, and possibly the most extraordinary thing it contained. By late 2012, something had shifted in the data coming out of Siberian hospitals. The Krokodil ward admissions that had been climbing steadily since 2009 began to plateau. By 2013, they were declining. By 2014, Russian health authorities were reporting a 75% reduction in Krokodil-related hospital presentations compared to the peak years. Officials pointed to the June 2012 codeine prescription law as the decisive intervention, the moment when the state had acted decisively and the epidemic had responded accordingly. The narrative was clean, causal, and politically satisfying. It was also significantly incomplete. The codeine restriction genuinely worked as a supply disruption mechanism. Making the primary ingredient prescription only created a barrier that was real, not trivial. Pharmacies that had previously sold codeine tablets over the counter to anyone with $3 now required a doctor's note. Obtaining prescriptions for the quantities needed for Krokodil production required either a legitimate medical condition, a corrupt physician, or access to a black market in prescription documents, all of which existed, but none of which were as frictionless as simply walking into a pharmacy. The Russian Federal Drug Control Service reported significant drops in over-the-counter codeine sales within months of the restriction taking effect. Production costs for Krokodil rose sharply as the primary input became harder to source. Simultaneously, a parallel shift in drug market economics was occurring that had nothing to do with Russian policy. Afghan heroin production had recovered and then expanded significantly from its early 2000s disruptions. The supply chains through Central Asia had restabilized and in some corridors had become more efficient. By 2012 and 2013, heroin prices in Russian cities were falling back toward the levels that had prevailed before the spike that had made Krokodil economically attractive in the first place. For an addict facing the choice between a cheaper, accessible heroin supply and the complex, dangerous, time-consuming production of Krokodil, the economics had reversed. Heroin was the easier option again. This created a grim dynamic that complicated any straightforward reading of the decline as a success story. The people who switched from Krokodil back to heroin were not recovering. They were transferring their addiction to a substance that would kill them more slowly, but just as certainly, in a country that still had no methadone treatment, no needle exchanges, and a legal framework that treated their condition as a criminal matter. The decline in Krokodil admissions was real. The underlying addiction crisis it had expressed was continuous, having simply changed its chemical vehicle. The number that nobody in the official narrative emphasized was this: Russian health authorities estimated that between 100,000 and 250,000 people had used Krokodil at the epidemic's peak. Life expectancy after first injection was documented at 1 to 3 years. By the time the admission statistics began to fall in 2013, the arithmetic of those two facts had been running for 4 years. A substantial proportion of the decline in active Krokodil users was not former users who had quit or switched. It was users who had died. The epidemic ended partly through policy intervention and partly through the simplest possible demographic mechanism. The population of active users was smaller because many of them no longer existed. The American episode of 2013 illustrated this dynamic from an unexpected angle. In September of that year, a cluster of reported Krokodil cases in Illinois and Arizona generated international media attention that briefly exceeded the coverage Russia had received at the epidemic's peak. American news organizations ran the same photographs that had been circulating in European medical journals for 2 years. Commentators speculated about a new drug crisis spreading westward. The DEA issued statements. Emergency rooms across the Midwest reportedly fielded calls from concerned citizens. For approximately 6 weeks, Krokodil was the most discussed drug in American media. Then the cases largely evaporated under clinical scrutiny. Several of the reported cases, when reviewed by toxicologists, showed wound patterns consistent with complications of black tar heroin injection rather than desomorphine. The drug did appear in small numbers of confirmed American cases. Some users had independently discovered the same synthesis route, or had encountered it through internet forums where the recipe was available. But the epidemic scale spread that the media coverage implied never materialized, for reasons that were chemically and economically logical. In the United States of 2013, the opioid landscape was already saturated. Prescription opioids were available in quantities that had created their own epidemic. Heroin was cheaper than it had been in decades. Fentanyl was beginning its emergence as the dominant force in the illicit opioid market, a substance 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine, far cheaper per dose than Krokodil's ingredient costs, and requiring no 4-hour cooking process in a fume-filled kitchen. The economic niche that Krokodil had occupied in Russia, cheap substitute for an inaccessible opioid, simply didn't exist in the American drug market of 2013. Krokodil required a specific combination of opioid scarcity and pharmaceutical accessibility that Russia in 2009 had provided perfectly, and the United States in 2013 did not. The international panic subsided. The American cases remained isolated. And the Russian epidemic, now officially described as controlled, moved into the phase of historical accounting that follows public health crises, the process of assigning numbers to what had happened and embedding those numbers into policy reports and academic papers, and the permanent record of what the decade had contained. The numbers resisted easy summary. Official Russian statistics on drug-related deaths were, by the admission of Russian public health researchers, significant undercounts. The cause of death coding practices in regional hospitals meant that deaths attributable to Krokodil were frequently recorded as sepsis, cardiac failure, or respiratory failure, without the underlying cause being formally documented. The real death toll from the epidemic was, by all independent estimates, substantially higher than official figures suggested. Some researchers placed it in the tens of thousands. Others, working from regional hospital data extrapolated to national scale, suggested the number could be higher still. The geographic record was more specific and in some ways more telling than the aggregate statistics. A map of Krokodil's Russian distribution, drawn from hospital admission data and law enforcement seizure records, corresponded almost perfectly to a map of post-Soviet industrial decline. The cities that had lost their factories in the 1990s, the towns whose populations had been contracting since 1991, the regions where youth unemployment had been above 30% for a decade, these were the coordinates of the epidemic. There were no exceptions to this pattern significant enough to require explanation. The drug had found, with the precision of a targeting system, exactly the places where people had the least to lose and the fewest resources to resist. Russia's neighbours watched the decline of the Russian epidemic with a mixture of relief and anxiety. Kazakhstan and Ukraine, which had both seen smaller but significant Krokodil use tied to the same Central Asian drug trafficking networks and similar post-Soviet economic conditions, reported their own declines following the Russian codeine restriction. Both countries implemented similar pharmaceutical controls in 2012 and 2013. The regional response, such as it was, came through supply restriction rather than treatment investment, consistent with the political framework that had governed the response throughout. The Russian government's public accounting of the epidemic's end concentrated heavily on the codeine restriction as the decisive intervention and was notably silent on the treatment infrastructure question. By 2014, methadone remained illegal, needle exchanges remained illegal. The harm reduction debate remained, officially, closed. The policy framework that had ensured the epidemic would run for 4 years before any significant intervention occurred remained entirely intact. The same conditions that had allowed Krokodil to reach catastrophic scale before being addressed were available and operational for the next crisis, whatever chemical form it would take. In the cities where the epidemic had been most concentrated, the physical evidence faded faster than anyone who had lived through it found comfortable. Apartments were cleaned and relet. Chemical residue was painted over. The wards that hospitals had informally designated for Krokodil cases returned to their previous functions. The visible infrastructure of the crisis disappeared with a speed that reflected both the practical pressures of urban life and a cultural preference for moving past experiences that were too painful and too implicating to fully absorb. What remained was in the people, not the buildings. The grandmothers still raising grandchildren. The surgeons who carried the visual memory of wounds they had never been trained to treat. The nurses who had developed wound care techniques through improvisation and had never been formally credited for the clinical knowledge they had generated. The journalists who had been inside the apartments and had brought the footage out and had watched the policy response arrive years late and address only the supply side of a catastrophe whose demand side was rooted in something no codeine restriction could touch. The epidemic ended. The conditions that had created it did not. Every drug epidemic leaves a specific shape in the society it moves through, a particular configuration of deaths, broken institutions, altered families, and unanswered questions that persist long after the drug itself has receded. Crack cocaine left specific neighborhoods in American cities structurally altered for decades. The opioid crisis left rural counties with demographic profiles permanently skewed by the loss of working-age adults. Krokodil left something different in character, if not in kind. A set of marks on Russian society that were distributed across the exact geography of existing damage, pressed into communities that were already weakened and absorbed without the public reckoning that might have converted catastrophe into policy change. The post-Soviet collapse was the true origin story, an understanding that origin was the one thing the Russian government had the most consistent political incentive to avoid. Acknowledging that Krokodil had grown specifically in the ruins of Soviet industrialization, in the cities that the post-1991 economic transition had abandoned without replacement, meant acknowledging the human cost of that transition in terms that were direct, quantified, and impossible to deflect. It meant connecting a drug that dissolved flesh to economic policies that had dissolved communities, and tracing the line between those two dissolutions with a kind of specificity that made comfortable narratives about Russian resilience and national progress difficult to sustain. The cities themselves carried the evidence in their demographics. Novokuznetsk, Omsk, Chelyabinsk, Yekaterinburg's outer districts. The population data from these places in the decade following the epidemic showed the specific signature of a community that had lost a disproportionate number of people in a specific age range. Young men and women in their 20s and 30s, the demographic that any society depends on for its economic and reproductive future, were missing from these communities in numbers that showed up in birth rate data, in workforce participation statistics, in the elementary school enrollment figures of the years that followed. The absent generation was invisible in official drug statistics and visible everywhere else. The children who had grown up in Krokodil households were, by 2015 and 2016, reaching adolescence, a developmental stage at which the accumulated effects of early trauma, chemical exposure, educational disruption, and attachment disorder were becoming clinically visible. Russian child psychologists working in affected regions began documenting a cohort of young people with profiles that reflected their specific early environments: hypervigilance, difficulty with emotional regulation, impaired executive function, and a particular relationship to authority and institutional care that combined desperate need with profound mistrust. These children were not statistics in any drug report. They appeared instead in juvenile justice data, in special education enrollments, in the caseloads of underfunded regional mental health services that had no framework for understanding what had shaped them. The medical professionals who had improvised their way through the epidemic years carried their own unacknowledged burden. The surgeons and nurses who had managed Krokodil cases without protocols, without resources, without psychological support had accumulated a clinical trauma load that the Russian healthcare system had no mechanism for recognizing or addressing. Post-traumatic stress among healthcare workers was not a category that Russian occupational medicine formally acknowledged in this period. The physicians who had watched patients die of wounds they couldn't adequately treat, who had made surgical decisions without adequate training or equipment, who had sent patients back into the same environment that had destroyed them because no other option existed. These people continued working, carrying their experience in the silence that professional life in underfunded regional healthcare required. The harm reduction debate, which the epidemic should logically have reopened, remained effectively closed in Russia throughout the mid-2000s. The evidence from the Krokodil years that punitive approaches without treatment infrastructure produced mass death rather than reduced drug use was available to any policymaker who chose to engage with it. Several Russian public health researchers published papers making exactly this argument, connecting the epidemic's scale and duration directly to the absence of harm reduction tools. These papers appeared in journals, were cited in international health policy discussions, and produced no change in Russian law. Methadone remained banned. Needle exchanges remained illegal. The ideological framework that had governed Russia's drug policy since the late 1990s absorbed the evidence of the Krokodil catastrophe and emerged unchanged. What the epidemic did produce, in a narrow but genuine sense, was a generation of Russian addiction medicine specialists with clinical knowledge that existed nowhere else in the world. The physicians who had treated Krokodil patients had encountered wound presentations, withdrawal complications, and toxic syndromes that their international colleagues had never seen. This knowledge was real, hard-won, and medically valuable. A repository of clinical experience built at extraordinary human cost. Its translation into international medical literature was partial and slow, filtered through a research infrastructure that was itself underfunded and institutionally marginalized. Some of it was published. More of it lived in the professional memories of physicians who had no particular venue or incentive to systematize it. The broader question of what Krokodil revealed about Russian society in the 2000s resisted the clean formulations that political analysis prefers. It was not simply a story about government failure, though government failure was comprehensive and well documented. It was not simply a story about poverty, though poverty was the environment in which the epidemic grew. It was not simply a story about addiction, or about pharmaceutical regulation, or about the post-Soviet transition. It was all of these things operating simultaneously, each one reinforcing the others, producing an outcome that none of them individually could fully explain. The invisibility of the affected population was the most fundamental enabling condition, and it operated across multiple registers simultaneously. These were people who were invisible economically, structurally unemployed in cities that had no economic function in the post-Soviet order. They were invisible politically, located in regions whose demographic weight gave them minimal representation in the policy conversations of the capital. They were invisible culturally, their deaths not mourned publicly, their lives not narrated in the national media in ways that created identification or empathy in audiences who didn't share their geography. Each layer of invisibility reinforced the others, creating a compound absence that allowed an epidemic of extraordinary scale and visibility to run for 4 years before producing a single significant policy response. The question of whether Russia learned from Krokodil is best answered not by examining what the government said in its aftermath, but by examining what it built. Treatment capacity in the post-epidemic years did not expand significantly in the regions most affected. Harm reduction remained legally prohibited. The social infrastructure, employment programs, mental health services, community support systems that might have addressed the underlying conditions remained absent from the post-industrial cities where the epidemic had concentrated. The codeine restriction remained the single enacted lesson, and it addressed supply while leaving demand entirely untouched. Fentanyl, which was beginning its catastrophic expansion in North American drug markets by the mid-2000s, had not yet reached Russian streets in significant quantities. But the conditions that had produced Krokodil, opioid demand without treatment infrastructure, poverty without economic alternatives, political invisibility without advocacy, remained fully operational. The specific chemistry had been disrupted. The social chemistry was intact. The survivors carried the most complex legacy. People who had used Krokodil and lived were, in any meaningful sense, extraordinary. Their survival required a specific combination of biological resilience, social luck, and individual determination that the drug's documented lethality made statistically remarkable. They carried their survival in bodies that were permanently marked: amputations, scarring, organ damage, the particular physiognomy of someone who had been through something that most human bodies don't survive. They lived in a culture that had no formal language for what they had been through, and no public space in which their experience was acknowledged. Some spoke to journalists when journalists came looking. Some participated in the church rehabilitation programs that had helped them survive, becoming informal counsellors for newer residents. Some simply lived, rebuilt partial lives in partial bodies, navigated the disability support system with its chronic inadequacies, raised children if they had children, maintained sobriety with the daily invisible effort that sobriety in their circumstances required. They were not heroes in the narrative sense. They were people who had been caught in something enormous and had, through various combinations of agency and chance, come out the other side still breathing. What Krokodil left behind in the end was not a lesson. Lessons require institutional uptake, policy response, the conversion of experience into change behaviour at a scale that reaches the next population at risk. Russia did not produce this. What Krokodil left was a record, in medical literature, in journalism archives, in the memories of physicians and nurses and family members and the few surviving addicts, in the demographic gaps of post-industrial cities, in the bodies of the people who'd been close enough to the epidemic to be permanently shaped by it. Records are not the same as lessons. They are what remains when the institutions that should have converted experience into change chose not to. They are the residue of a catastrophe that was visible, documented, reported, filmed, and published, and that nonetheless ran its full course because the people it consumed were not the people whose suffering organised political responses. Every society gets the drug epidemic its social order produces. Krokodil was not an accident of Russian chemistry. It was the chemical expression of what Russia had decided, through decades of specific choices about which places mattered and which people counted to leave behind. The drug was made in kitchens. The conditions that made those kitchens were made in offices far away, by people who would never smell the solvent or see the wounds or sit in the corridor of a regional hospital at 3 a.m, watching something irreversible continue to happen. The kitchens are empty now. The smell has faded from the walls, and in the cities east of the Urals, in the apartment buildings where the wallpaper is still slightly yellowed near the stove, the people who remember what happened there are getting older, and the people who come after them will inherit the demographic silence without inheriting the explanation for it. That silence is the last thing Krokodil left, and it is, in its own way, the most accurate record of all.